Hello, friends. Our today's topic is none other than an American poet, essayist, journalist, a humanist who was a part of transition between transcendentalism and realism, and who incorporated both views in his works. I'm talking of none other than the great 19th century American poet Walt Whitman. He was born in 1819 and died in 1892. In this way, you can understand he belongs to 19th century America. He was born in a farming community near Huntington, Long Island, that is in USA. So farming community means his father was a farmer. So he belongs to rural area of America, son of a farmer. The name of the place of his birth is Long Island, and it was near Huntington. It's quite interesting to know that he was 9 siblings in total, and he was the second son of those 9 children of his parents. It means he had a huge family. His father, of course, he belonged to that farming community, but by profession, he was not actually a farmer but a carpenter. And he did not become that much successful in that profession. One interesting thing that I have found about his father, that he was not an educated man, but read essays of Tom Paine, Tompane, Tom Paine. He used to read his essays, Tom Paine's essays. Who was Tom Paine? He was one of the guiding spirits behind American Revolution. Means the ideas of Tom Paine were very revolutionary in nature, and that contributed in American Revolution as well. So it means his father was even an uneducated man. He had political interest. He was aware of the revolution. He was aware of the revolutionary thought. So, as we know, if father was having such kind of qualities with his personality, then why cannot we expect the same from the son, Walt Whitman? And that, I think, has made him the poet of democracy of United States of America. So I have to talk about 2 people here with whom his father was acquainted, and through his father ultimately he was acquainted. with them or with their works. So one was Tom Paine. The second one was Elias Hicks. Elias Hicks. Eliashicks. Elias Hicks. He was a leader of the Quaker religious sect. Quaker. Quaker. It's the name of a religious sect. We'll talk about it later. So we have to talk of Elias Hicks, who belonged to this particular religious sect that is known as Quaker. We should know what was the thinking of Elias Hicks. So his doctrine that we have to know here, what was his opinion? The true worship of the divinity must be experienced as an inner light within the individual worshipper. See how beautifully he is talking of the spirituality. What does he say? The true worship of the divinity must be experienced as an inner light. So means God is a substance to be felt from within the individual worshipper. So God should be like inner light in the individuals, the same that we have in Sanskrit. Atma Deepo Bhava. Atma Deepo Bhava means be self-enlightened. So the presence of God, the presence of divinity in an individual should enlighten him or her. That was the doctrine of Elias Hicks as well. So as we talked about two persons, one was Tom Paine, the second one was Elias Hicks. These two people were idolized by Whitman. What was the reason? Because these two people were having independent spirit in them. Independent spirit, something revolutionary, that one can say. Since Whitman was much influenced by Elias Hicks, so that influence led him to that particular religious sect, that is Quaker. So we find that Whitman used Quaker terms and references in his poems and expressed a mystical individualism resembling Quaker approach. Means Whitman seemed to be influenced by Quaker approach, and that influence we can easily trace in his poems, where we find a mystical individualism. Mystical individualism. Now let's talk about Quaker. What is Quaker? Quakers are members of a group with Christian roots that began in England in 1650s. It means 1650s means later half of 17th century. This Quaker sect emerged in England, and of course they were of Christian roots, means Initially, they used to be Christians, and later they follow a new path, a new way, you can say, a new approach that they started having, which was known as Quakers. Now, let's talk of their belief. What do they believe? There is a direct relationship between God and each believer. Every human being contains something of God. This is often called the light of God. See, what do they say? There is a direct relationship between God and each believer. Direct relationship means no mediator is needed. No middleman is needed. The same as we have in Bhakti movement in India. When the religious reformers, the saints like Ramanujacharya, Ramananda, and other saints, they started talking of bhakti, and they stated that there is no need of a mediator in between the deity and the devotee. Deity means divine power, God. Devotee means the worshipper. So they said that they should be linked directly. There should be nothing as hindrance. The same we are having in Quakers' approach, in their belief. And what is the other point that they say? They say every human being contains something of God. Don't you think that is very much similar to the concept of Atma and Paramatma? Atma means soul, Paramatma means oversoul. If we talk in terms of Ralph Waldo Emerson, or the super soul, as we know, when we talk of soul or Atma, we know how it is seen as a fraction of the greater individual, that is oversoul, Paramatma. And this Atma always tries to be combined with Paramatma, and that is the ultimate goal of Atma that we see in our Indian tradition, in our Indian concept. Indian, I mean, it's basically concerned with the Sanatan Dharma. This is often called the light of God. See, this is something different that we see. That they say that every individual has some part, some fraction of that greater entity, that greater, power, that is called God. They say that every individual has some part from that God within themselves, and that part is light of God. So they see that part within different individuals as light of God. Let's talk about Whitman's professions. He had 6 years of formal education. So only 6 years of formal education. Then you can understand that he could not pass his matric or the high school in his formal education. And then after started working as an apprentice printer. So after 6 years of formal education, Whitman started his career, his professional career, as an apprentice printer. Then from 1836 to 1838, means for 2 years, he worked as a school teacher. And then he went for journalism, and he did it for over 20 years, a long time duration. In the same period, he started his career as a writer. So when he was doing journalism, at that very time he started his career as a writer. And one basic theme that we should know, that we find in his poems, is opposition to slavery. And that is why I told you that he is considered to be the poet of democracy. When we talk of his works, we have to talk of his Magnum Opus. Magnum Opus, you understand? Magnum Opus, this is the Latin phrase which is used for the greatest achievement of a writer. So the Magnum Opus of Whitman was Leaves of Grass. Leaves, Leaves, of Grass, Grass. Leaves of Grass. It is always asked that mention the year of publication of Leaves of Grass. So it was first published in 1855. And one interesting thing that we should know, that in that first edition, the author's name appeared neither on the cover nor on the title page. So initially when we turn the pages, the title page and the cover page, we don't find the name of the poet there in the first edition of Leaves of Grass. So where do we find the name of the poet? Following a preface. So of course, when it was published in the form of a book, it must have a preface, and that it has. So after preface, there were 12 untitled poems. So we are talking of the content that is there in Leaves of Grass. First we have preface, then we have 12 untitled poems. Then interestingly enough, on page 29 of that first edition, in the text of first titled poem. Why this first titled poem? Because previous 12 poems were untitled, means content of the poem was there but title was not mentioned, title was not written. So in the first titled poem, and the name of the poem is Song of Myself, a very famous poem by Whitman. In that very poem, we find the author's name for the first and only time, means first and last, you can say, the name that is mentioned there. And see how beautifully he accepts what he is. What Whitman says in his Song of Myself, and I quote, Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshy and sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding. No sentimentalist, no stander above men and women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. See how beautifully he is defining himself. An American that he was, because he was American citizen, born in that country. One of the roughs that he accepts that he is one of the roughs, means he is not very fair kind of person in his behavior. Rough. A cosmos, disorderly, fleshy, means you will not find any proper order there in his personality. Sensual, so he accepts that he believed in satisfaction of the senses as well. Sensual, and for that satisfaction, what he says, eating, drinking, and breeding, that a general human being does, and in that manner he accepts that I am a common human being like you. Eating, drinking, and breeding, no sentimentalist. So he declares that he is not a sentimentalist. We had a tradition there of writing sentimental comedy in England, the reaction of which came in the form of anti-sentimental comedy, and for that we have a very fine example of anti-sentimental comedy that was performed for the first time in 1773, She Stoops to Conquer, by Oliver Goldsmith. Move to the point. He says, no sentimentalist, no stander above men and women. So he says that I am not above. I am not a person who stands above men or women. Means he has the same level. Or apart from them, means he says I am the part of you all. No more modest than immodest. See how paradoxical line this is. He defines his modesty in the form of being immodest. He says no more modest than immodest. Let's now talk of organic theory of Whitman. Whitman's organic theory of art. What was his view regarding this? He says, art like life and like trees and shrubs has a natural growth. See how he is comparing art with life and trees. Trees, they are also living things, life. So art is like life and trees and shrubs. And in that manner, in that comparison, he says that it has a natural growth. Means art also has a natural growth. When the term natural comes, then we have to talk of its binary opposite, that is artificial. Means indirectly he tries to say that it does not have any artificial growth. Let's move further. He says that each book, each poem should develop according to its own law. Means there should not be any hindrance in the development of a particular book or a poem. There should not be any condition for that. It should have its own law, freely, unhampered by artificial restrictions that we find many of the times, that artificial restrictions in while writing literature. So he says there is no need of artificial restrictions. There should not be any artificial restrictions or conventions. Convention, you understand? Something that is accepted by all people of a particular community or society on a certain period of time, on a certain in a certain period of time. And convention itself says that it is accepted by all, but see, it doesn't mean that convention should not be changed. It should be changed. So he says that this art should not be hampered by any conventions or artificial restrictions, and that poetry should be a spontaneous expression of life. Spontaneous, that comes from within. There is no need of extra effort for that. When something is spontaneous, means it's very natural, it's very automatic. There is no need of any extra effort for that. So he says poetry should be a spontaneous expression of life. There we have a poet like Matthew Arnold who says poetry is criticism of life. One poet that we have in Romanticism, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling, emotions recollected in tranquility. And here we are having a poet like Whitman who says that poetry should be a spontaneous expression of life. Spontaneous expression means life should be very much visible there. Very naturally it should come in the writing, in the poems by a poet. And when we talk of this theory, the theory of art that Whitman had, when we trace that, we can say that he may have derived it from S.T. Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But he applied it in his own way. He just, he did not just follow it. He applied it in his own way, extending the connection between art and life to a literal identification between the poetry and poet himself. So he talks of the connection between art and life. On which level? To a literal identification. So there should be literal identification in between art and life. And there he moves one step further to a literal identification between the poetry and poet himself. Poetry and poet. So there should be literal identification that this is poetry, this is poet. And of course, when he says that poetry should be spontaneous expression of life, so we find poet in his poetry, as when we talk of Whitman's view. See, how does he say? He says, and I quote, "Camarado, this is no book. Who touches this touches a man." Means book should not be considered as simply a book. He says, who touches this touches a man. Means the book talks of man. The book has autobiographical elements. It should have. Means he took poetry as autobiography. Means the personality of the poet must be visible there in his poetry. This is what Whitman assumed or propounded, understood, stated. That's all. Thank you. It's Anand Tripathi. Nice to be in conversation with you all. Thanks for today.